Sayuri was an orphan, taken in by a wealthy family when she was just a young girl. Though they provided her with everything a child could ever need, a sense of emptiness always lingered within her. The grand house, the fancy clothes, the expensive gifts. None of it made her feel like she truly belonged. Her adoptive parents, loving as they were, couldn't fill the gap she felt deep in her soul. Sayuri would often look out the large windows of their mansion, wondering about the family she could have had, the life she could have led. They were kind to her, but there was a disconnect, a feeling that no amount of wealth or luxury could ever erase. As Sayuri grew older, the pressure mounted. Her adoptive parents, who had always treated her like their own daughter, began to show their true intentions. It wasn't just about love anymore. It was about status, legacy, and appearances. The expectation was clear. Sayuri needed to marry a man who would maintain the family's high standing. They never outright said it, but the subtle hints, the discussions about suitable suitors, and the long lists of eligible bachelors were all too obvious. But Sayuri, deeply aware of her own desires and dreams, didn't want to marry for status or obligation. She wanted love, the kind of love that was real and not influenced by wealth or family expectations. Her protests fell on deaf ears. Her adoptive parents were determined. They had already chosen Ibrahim, a man from a modest background. His name was Ibrahim, and he seemed to fit the bill of what they considered an acceptable match. Though not wealthy, he was stable and respectable. Sayuri knew little about him. He wasn't someone she had ever envisioned herself with. He didn't stand out in any way. He was quiet, reserved, and not particularly attractive to her. But to her adoptive parents, he was an ideal choice. A man of character, someone who wouldn't threaten their reputation, someone who could provide for her without overshadowing the family's wealth. The idea of marrying Ibrahim felt more like a prison sentence than a choice. Sayuri found herself stuck in the tension between what she wanted and what her family demanded. There was no escaping it. She had been raised to understand that family obligations came first, and her desires were secondary. Still, as the wedding day approached, a sense of dread filled her. The idea of pledging her life to someone she barely knew, someone she didn't love, was unbearable. The wedding arrangements were swift, almost mechanical. Invitations were sent out, the venue was booked, and the guests were gathered. Sayuri could feel the weight of the event looming over her. Her family was excited, of course. They saw it as another opportunity to solidify their place in society. They planned for the wedding to be a grand affair, one that would be talked about for years to come, a perfect reflection of their wealth and prestige. But for Sayuri, the entire event felt rushed, cold, and devoid of any personal meaning. The more she thought about it, the more trapped she felt. The extravagant decorations, the flashing cameras, the smiles of the guests, they were all for show. None of it reflected who she truly was, or what she truly wanted. As she stood at the altar looking at Ibrahim, Sayuri couldn't help but wonder if there was more to this marriage than what she had been told. Her heart wasn't in it, but there was no turning back. She knew she had to go through with it. What choice did she have? Her parents' expectations, the weight of family honor, and the judgment of their social circle all pressed down on her. She felt small, insignificant, and utterly alone in that moment. She had no idea that this decision, this forced commitment, would be the turning point in her life, setting the stage for a series of events that would unravel everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and identity. But for now, all she could do was smile and take her place beside a man she didn't know, a man who seemed as distant and unreachable as the life she had always dreamed of. In the weeks that followed the whirlwind wedding, Sayuri's life with Ibrahim felt like an entirely different world. What had once seemed like a potential path to happiness had swiftly devolved into something that left her feeling hollow and frustrated. The life she had imagined for herself, a life filled with passion and excitement, now seemed unreachable, like a far-off dream she would never wake up from. The reality of her marriage was nothing like she had hoped. They lived in a modest house, a sharp contrast to the luxurious mansion she had grown up in. The lavish lifestyle she was accustomed to, the elegant parties, the designer clothes, the extravagant dinners, had been replaced by a simpler, quieter existence. Though the house was warm and inviting in its own way, it lacked the splendor of the life she once knew. Every corner of their home whispered of humility and restraint, and she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss every time she stepped inside. The walls felt too small, the ceilings too low. It was as if her world had been compressed into a tiny box, and she wasn't sure how to breathe within it. Ibrahim, for his part, was an enigma. He was kind, always polite, but there was something elusive about him that unsettled Sayuri. He rarely spoke about his past, and when he did, his stories seemed guarded, like they were pieces of a larger puzzle he wasn't ready to share. He spoke about business trips and important meetings, but the details were always vague, never specific enough to provide her with a clear picture. She wanted to trust him, wanted to believe he was as genuine as he seemed, but there was a wall between them that she couldn't cross. She began to notice strange things happening in their small home, things that made her more suspicious with each passing day. Ibrahim would receive phone calls at odd hours, his voice low and urgent, but when she asked him about it, he would merely shrug and tell her it was nothing. She never got a straight answer, and though she hated to admit it, she started to feel like there was something he was hiding from her. The quiet, reserved man she had married seemed to harbor secrets, and they weighed heavily on her heart. One afternoon, a mysterious package arrived at their doorstep. It was large, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. It was addressed to Ibrahim. Sayuri, unable to resist her growing curiosity, asked him about it as soon as he came home. His face tightened for a brief moment before he smiled and dismissed it. "Just some old business stuff," he said, his tone flat and unconvincing. "Nothing for you to worry about." But the way he avoided her gaze, the way he seemed to close off emotionally in that instant, left a sinking feeling in her stomach. There was something off about the way he reacted. Sayuri wasn't sure what was happening, but she felt an overwhelming sense of unease creeping into her thoughts. She had to know what was going on. The unease grew as the days wore on. Ibrahim's demeanor shifted like the tides. Sometimes he would be distant, lost in thought, and at other times he would be curt and cold. Sayuri would ask him about their plans for the future, about what kind of life they were building together, but his answers were always vague, always non-committal. It was as if he was intentionally keeping her at arm's length, refusing to let her in. The contrast between her life before marriage and her current life became too much for her to ignore. Before, she had everything: a loving family, a high-status social circle, a life of luxury. Now, her world was confined to Ibrahim's modest home and his silent presence. The lavish parties and dinners with friends had been replaced by quiet nights in their small living room. She had once been surrounded by people who admired her, envied her, and now she was alone with a man who couldn't or wouldn't share his world with her. She felt trapped. The thought of returning to her adoptive family seemed impossible. They had made it clear that this marriage was what they expected from her. The burden of their expectations pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, and yet her marriage to Ibrahim wasn't what she had imagined it would be. There was no passion, no connection. There was only silence and confusion. She had made a mistake. She could feel it deep down, but how could she get out of it? At times, the frustration and loneliness became overwhelming. She began to talk to her closest friends and family members, seeking validation, seeking someone to tell her that she hadn't made the wrong choice. But when she tried to open up, she was met with empty reassurances. "You're just adjusting, Sayuri. Marriage takes time," her mother would say. "Ibrahim is a good man, and he's doing his best," her friends would add. though they never truly understood the disconnect she felt. Her social life was a stark contrast to her marriage. She would go out with friends, attending parties and social events, and it would feel like a breath of fresh air. The lively conversations, the laughter, the warmth. It was all so different from the coldness she felt at home. She began to feel torn between the world she once knew and the reality she now lived in. The more time she spent with her friends, the more isolated she felt from Ibrahim. It was as if they were living in two entirely different worlds, and the gap between them was widening by the day. The frustration only grew as Ibrahim remained as stoic as ever. Whenever she voiced her concerns or frustrations, he would respond in the same way, calm, detached, as if her feelings were unimportant. "You're just imagining things, Sayuri," he would say. "Everything is fine." His dismissive attitude made her feel as though she was overreacting, as though she was the problem. And yet the doubts continued to gnaw at her. Was she truly imagining things? Or was there something more to Ibrahim that she wasn't seeing? Every day felt like a new puzzle, and the pieces didn't seem to fit together. Ibrahim was hiding something. She could feel it in the air. The tension was thick, suffocating, and with each passing day, Sayuri couldn't help but wonder what she had gotten herself into. Sayuri had no idea what she was about to discover. It all started on an ordinary afternoon when she had been going through some old family papers that had been left in a drawer of their house. She had intended to organize them and pass the time, but her eyes were drawn to a particular envelope that looked out of place. It was thick, the kind of envelope one might receive from a law firm or a government office. Curiosity piqued. She opened it, expecting a simple letter or document. What she found inside was nothing like she had imagined. Inside the envelope was a document that listed business holdings, international investments, and numerous properties spread across several countries. It was a detailed record of a vast fortune, a fortune tied to none other than Ibrahim. The name on the document was unmistakable: Ibrahim al-Mahdi. There was no mistaking it. It was his name, yet the scale of the wealth detailed in the papers was unimaginable. Ibrahim, the quiet man who had been living a modest life with her, had never mentioned a word about this. She had thought of him as humble, even poor, but here it was, a record of his empire. He had carefully hidden this part of his life, and in that moment, it became painfully clear to Sayuri that she had been deceived. Ibrahim wasn't poor at all. He was a man of immense wealth, yet he had chosen to live like he had nothing. A wave of emotions flooded her: shock, confusion, betrayal. She couldn't understand why he had kept this a secret from her. They had built their life together on the premise that they were equals, that they were sharing something simple and true. And now, that foundation seemed shattered. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of it. Why had Ibrahim hidden such a crucial part of himself? Why had he gone to such lengths to conceal the truth? That evening, Ibrahim returned home from one of his mysterious business trips. Sayuri could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had to confront him. There was no more pretending, no more staying in the dark. As he walked into the living room, she didn't waste a moment. "Ibrahim," she said, her voice trembling but firm, "we need to talk." He looked at her, his face unreadable, as always. "What's on your mind?" Without saying a word, Sayuri placed the papers in front of him. Ibrahim's eyes flickered to the documents, and for a moment, he seemed frozen, as if he had been caught in the act. His expression remained stoic, but the tension in the room was palpable. She stared at him, waiting for an explanation, her breath shallow. I found these," Sayuri said quietly. "You're not poor, are you, Ibrahim?" He sighed, sitting down slowly, and she could see the weight of his silence. He didn't speak for a long moment, as if he were collecting his thoughts, or perhaps even preparing himself to tell the truth. "Sayuri," he began softly, "I didn't want you to find out this way. I didn't want to burden you with my wealth. I didn't want that to be the reason you stayed with me. I wanted you to love me for who I am, not for what I have. She stared at him, her heart beating faster. You've been lying to me this entire time. I wasn't lying, Ibrahim said, his voice calm, though his eyes betrayed a trace of regret. I just didn't tell you the whole truth. My family is incredibly wealthy, yes. But I didn't want to marry someone for the money. I didn't want a life where people would only see me as the heir to a fortune. I wanted to marry you, Sayuri, for who you are. Not for your family's wealth, not for your connections. I didn't want you to see me as just another man with money. I wanted to be with you because I love you, not because of what I have. Sayuri felt a mix of emotions crash over her, betrayal, confusion, and surprisingly, a sense of relief. She had always felt something was missing, something didn't add up, but hearing the truth from Ibrahim's lips left her grappling with her feelings. She had loved him for the man he presented himself to be, a humble, quiet man with no pretensions, no arrogance. But now, hearing this, she felt like everything she thought she knew about him had been built on a lie. The man she thought was beneath her, the man she had pity on, was actually someone far more important than she could have ever imagined. The weight of his wealth seemed to drown the man she had known, and she wasn't sure how to process it. I don't understand, Sayuri whispered, her voice shaking. Why didn't you tell me? Why hide it from me? I didn't want you to feel like you were marrying me for my wealth, Ibrahim said softly, reaching out to her. I wanted to be loved for who I am, not for what I have. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would only see me as a rich man, not as the person who loves you. Sayuri closed her eyes, trying to absorb everything he was saying. She had always felt like an outsider in her own life, adopted, distant from her family, and now she realized that even in her marriage, she had been living a lie. She thought she had married a simple man, someone who understood the struggles she had faced, someone who didn't care about money or status. But in the end, the truth was more complicated than she had ever imagined. I don't know what to think anymore, she said, her voice a mixture of hurt and confusion. I loved you for who I thought you were, but now I don't know who you really are. I'm still the same man, Sayuri, Ibrahim said, his voice full of sincerity. I'm still the man who loves you, the man who wants to build a life with you. But I needed you to see me as myself, not as the wealth I was born into. Please understand. I didn't want this to come between us. Sayuri sat there, her mind racing, trying to understand Ibrahim's motives. She wanted to be angry, wanted to yell at him for deceiving her, but deep down, she knew that his intentions hadn't been malicious. He had hidden the truth because he didn't want it to overshadow their relationship. Yet the revelation left her heart heavy with doubt. I need some time, she whispered, her voice breaking. I need time to figure this out. Ibrahim nodded, his face filled with regret. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk. As he left the room, Sayuri was left alone with her thoughts. The life she had once known seemed like a distant memory, and she wasn't sure where she fit into this new world. But one thing was clear. The man she had married, the man she thought she knew, had hidden a part of himself from her. And now, everything was different. The days following the revelation felt like a blur to Sayuri. The weight of Ibrahim's secret weighed heavily on her heart, leaving her in a state of emotional turmoil. The man she had married, the man she had trusted, had hidden a part of himself that was so fundamental. Every moment she spent with him now felt tainted by that secret. The truth seemed to blur everything she had believed about their relationship. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Had Ibrahim truly loved her, or had he simply manipulated her feelings? Had their entire marriage been based on a lie, or was his love for her genuine despite his hidden fortune? Every conversation, every smile, every glance from him felt different now. The person she had thought she knew was suddenly a stranger, and the trust they had built seemed to crumble beneath the surface. Ibrahim, ever patient and understanding, tried to ease her pain. He gave her space to think, but whenever they crossed paths, he would reach out to her gently, hoping to bridge the gap. "Sayuri, I know this is difficult," he would say softly, his voice filled with concern. "I never wanted to hurt you. Please, just know that I love you." But Sayuri couldn't find peace. His words, though sincere, did little to heal the growing chasm between them. She wanted to believe him, but the truth of his actions gnawed at her. How could she trust him again? If he could hide something as important as his wealth, what else had he kept from her? Her heart ached with the confusion that had taken root in her mind. The love they once shared now felt fragile, like glass on the verge of shattering. As the emotional turmoil continued to churn within her, Sayuri knew she needed answers. She turned to her adoptive parents, hoping they could provide some clarity. They too had been taken aback by the revelation. They had always known Ibrahim as the humble man who had courted Sayuri, and they had believed in the integrity of his character. But now, learning about his vast fortune, they felt betrayed as well. How could they have allowed their daughter to marry someone who had hidden such an important truth from her? The confrontation came one evening when Ibrahim returned home to find Sayuri's parents waiting for him in the living room. The air was thick with tension as her adoptive mother, her face flushed with emotion, spoke first. "Ibrahim, how could you do this?" she asked, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and hurt. "You deceived us all, including Sayuri. You knew how much we valued honesty, and yet you kept this secret from us. What kind of person does that?" Ibrahim stood tall, his face calm, but his eyes filled with regret. "I never wanted to deceive anyone," he said quietly. "I love Sayuri, and I wanted to marry her for who she is, not for her family's wealth. I didn't want my background to change how she saw me. I wanted her to love me for me, not for what I had." Her father, who had remained silent up until then, stood up, his voice stern. "And yet, you chose to deceive her. You hid who you are from her, and now she's left questioning everything, about you, about us, about her own life. What kind of love is that? You should have been honest from the beginning." Ibrahim's gaze dropped to the floor, guilt overwhelming him. "I understand your anger, and I deeply regret that my decision has caused so much pain. But I had no intention of hurting anyone. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that if Sayuri truly loved me, my wealth wouldn't matter. I didn't want to burden her with it." The room fell into a heavy silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. It was clear that both Ibrahim and Sayuri's parents were struggling to reconcile their expectations with the reality of what had been revealed. The question that lingered in the air was whether they could find a way forward, or if the damage had already been done. Later that evening, after her parents had left, Sayuri sat alone in the dimly lit living room. The house felt empty, despite Ibrahim's presence. He sat beside her, his hand hovering near hers, but she pulled away, unwilling to let him in. Her mind raced as she reflected on everything that had transpired. Ibrahim's confession had shaken her to her core. The love she had thought they shared felt clouded now, tainted by doubt. But as she thought more about the man he had been, the man who had cared for her, supported her, and treated her as an equal despite his hidden wealth, she couldn't help but see his sincerity. It was clear that he had not lied out of malice. He had hidden his wealth out of fear that it would overshadow everything else. He had sacrificed his own identity in an attempt to make their relationship feel genuine. Her emotions were torn. On one hand, she felt hurt and betrayed, and on the other, she recognized the depth of his love for her. Could she forgive him for hiding such an important truth? Could she rebuild the trust that had been shattered? As the days passed, Sayuri found herself at a crossroads. The tension between them was unbearable, and yet she couldn't deny the connection they still shared. The question that consumed her thoughts was whether she could move past the hurt and find a way to rebuild their marriage. Sayuri took long walks alone, lost in her thoughts. She spent hours reflecting on their time together, on the simple moments, the laughter, the tenderness. They had built a life together, even if it wasn't based on wealth. But could she continue to live with the knowledge that Ibrahim had kept such a monumental part of himself hidden from her? Ibrahim gave her the space she needed, never pushing her to make a decision. He waited, as patient as ever, for her to come to terms with everything. He had made mistakes, yes, but he had also been honest about his feelings and the reasons behind his actions. His love for her was real. He hadn't lied about that. The decision before Sayuri felt overwhelming. To forgive Ibrahim would mean accepting his flaws, his mistakes, and rebuilding the trust that had been lost. But to leave him would mean giving up on everything they had built, walking away from the love that had once felt so pure. She didn't want to make a rash decision in the heat of the moment. She needed to reflect on her feelings, to decide if she could truly forgive him, or if their marriage was beyond repair. And so, with a heavy heart, she stood at the crossroads, unsure of which path to take. The days that followed were filled with silent reflection for Sayuri. The questions and doubts that had plagued her for weeks slowly began to subside. She found herself thinking more about Ibrahim's actions, his reasons for hiding the truth, and the love they had shared. She could see the pain in his eyes every time he looked at her, pain born from guilt, but also from the fear of losing her. Sayuri began to understand that his decision to keep his wealth a secret wasn't born from malice, it was born from love. In her heart, she realized that her true feelings for Ibrahim were far deeper than the anger and resentment she had initially felt. The hurt she had experienced was real, but it was temporary. The foundation of their relationship, of the life they had built together, was built on trust, care, and genuine affection. The wealth that Ibrahim had hidden from her, though a shock, was insignificant in comparison to the love and sacrifices he had shown her. She spent days alone, thinking, walking, and reflecting on the life she had with him. Sayuri realized that true love wasn't about perfection. It was about understanding, forgiveness, and the willingness to grow together. Her anger at Ibrahim's deception began to fade, replaced by a deep understanding of his heart and the sacrifices he had made for their love. He had chosen her, despite the risks, and had done so with the hope that she would love him for who he truly was, not for the wealth that his family had accumulated. And so, with a quiet but resolute heart, Sayuri made her decision. She would stay with Ibrahim, not because of his fortune, but because she had come to truly understand him. She loved him, not for the life he could have provided her, but for the man he was. She realized that no relationship could ever be perfect, but a real, lasting love required honesty, understanding, and the willingness to accept each other's flaws. The decision wasn't easy. There were still moments of doubt, still times when the weight of his secret seemed overwhelming. But every time she looked at him, every time he reached out to hold her hand or whisper words of reassurance, she remembered why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. It was never about his wealth. It was about the way he made her feel, the way he supported her, and the way he always put her first, even when it meant making difficult choices. Their relationship, once filled with secrets and doubts, began to transform. Ibrahim, too, realized the importance of openness and honesty. He had spent so long hiding behind his wealth, afraid of what it might do to their love. But now he understood that love wasn't just about what you had. It was about who you were and what you were willing to give up for each other. Together, they began to rebuild their life, not on the foundation of money or status, but on the foundation of trust, love, and understanding. Sayuri learned to accept the complexities of their relationship, his wealth, his family, his past. And Ibrahim learned to trust her with everything he had, knowing that she loved him for the man he truly was. They didn't rush into a new chapter of their life. They took things slow, allowing their relationship to grow naturally, without the pressures of societal expectations or family pressures. For the first time, they were free to simply be who they were, without fear, without secrets, and without the weight of pretenses. As time passed, their bond grew stronger. The love they had once shared was now even deeper, more profound. Ibrahim was no longer a man with a secret. He was simply Ibrahim, the man who loved Sayuri with all his heart, the man who had chosen her despite the world around them. And Sayuri was no longer just the woman who had been shocked by his secret. She was the woman who had learned the true meaning of love, and who was willing to embrace all the complexities that came with it. One evening, as they sat together in their modest home, watching the sunset and sipping tea, Sayuri looked at Ibrahim with a peaceful smile. The tension that once defined their relationship had melted away, replaced by an unspoken understanding. She had come to see Ibrahim for who he truly was, not the man with wealth, but the man with a kind heart, a gentle soul, and a love for her that was unwavering. As she reflected on everything that had happened, she realized how far they had come. The path to forgiveness and understanding had been long and challenging, but it had been worth it. The pain of the past had paved the way for a love that was stronger, more authentic, and more beautiful than either of them could have imagined. They had learned the hardest lesson of all, that true love required patience, trust, and the willingness to look beyond the surface. Sayuri's heart swelled with gratitude as she realized that Ibrahim's secret, though painful at the time, had ultimately brought them closer together. It had forced them to confront their fears, their doubts, and their insecurities, and in the end, they had emerged stronger, their love more solid than ever. She took Ibrahim's hand, feeling the warmth of his touch, and smiled. "I'm glad I stayed," she whispered softly, her voice full of emotion. "I'm glad we found our way back to each other." Ibrahim squeezed her hand in return, his eyes filled with love and contentment. "So am I, Sayuri. So am I." As they sat there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, they knew that their journey was far from over. But no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, honestly, lovingly, and without secrets. Because in the end, love was all that mattered, and they had found that against all odds.